So Brett Whiteley, West of the Divide, brings together paintings, sculptures, prints and drawings, all influenced by the landscape of the Central West, from works, a work that Brett Whiteley created when he was just 19, Sofala in 1958, right through to Memories of School, Winter Poplars, which was created before his death in 1992. So they really cover the whole of Brett Whiteley's creative career. What was it about this landscape that kept him coming back?
Oh, it's beauty, honestly. And you see it every time you come. I forget too. But driving up recently, I just got a shock again at how beautiful it actually is. Lloyd Rees loved it too, the rolling hills and things around Bathurst. But I mean, it's a strong childhood connection for Brett. The landscape around Bathurst was where he basically grew up. Between living in a coastal city like Sydney and coming to boarding school here in Scots in Bathurst, the landscape became part of his nature and soul. And we came back here, even as a couple, we came back much later after we'd lived in Europe for years, around Carrefour Oberon, because he was attracted to it, and you can't help it, it's just very beautiful countryside. But no, the early abstractionists, the kind of, the sexual thing about them comes a lot from the rolling hills, and also the recognition that Lloyd Rees had buxomy kind of hills and things in his.
So I was going to ask you about that influence. It's really apparent when you look at these works. Obviously, Brett Whiteley first encountered Rees's work when he was a teenager in the 1950s, and the influence of works like Road to Bury, Landscape at Orange, those early landscapes of Rees's are very apparent here. But as you say, Brett Whiteley's just imbued them with such a sensuousness and vitality, and these rolling hills and the curvaceous roads and the rivers. How important were those early influences, such as Rees, on Whiteley's perception of the landscape?
Well, Australia's a young country. Lloyd Rees was somebody that Brett always admired, both as a person, but primarily as an artist. He knew him briefly when he was very young, because he used to go to the Jack Santry Sketch Club in Northwood. He never drew there because that was always drawing the nude there, the naked model. He used to hire one every week, and that's where Brett took me on my first date. So I met Lloyd Rees then too. But he'd seen his work, and he was a local artist, that Brett admired enormously. But his work itself, he wouldn't have unless he'd admired the work. His instinct just drove him towards that work, and it was certainly a pivot. Lloyd Rees was certainly a pivot for Brett, seeing the landscape in those kind of sexual, sensual terms, which he pointed out to Lloyd, how sex these things. And Lloyd, of course, was amazed, because he just didn't think like that. He didn't see these as bums and breasts. He saw them as hills, rolling hills. But he quite liked it, he quite fancied it in the end. But because he was of another generation, he wasn't going to think that. He just wasn't going to think. It wasn't natural to him to think like that, because they didn't talk about things like that, really. But he quite fancied it.
And of course he admired Brett Whiteley's work very much later.
They loved each other anyway. There was a special bond between the two of them, definitely.
There's a beautiful sense of whimsy and fun in works such as the totems. There's so much life in these paintings. There are eggs and birds and a platypus and trees and rivers. And you can sense in these works that he's putting his soul, his life force almost into these works. What was it that drove his creative soul?
I don't know what drives a creative soul. If it's there, and Brett certainly had that in spades. He was also very ambitious, but ambitious in the way that he set himself up to a very high standard. And if he failed that standard in his own mind, then he would be very disappointed with himself. So he was always determined to keep doing what he did, which was be a painter. The methods that he used annoy some people, like this one behind us, like actually sticking an animal on the front and things like that. That definitely came from the kind of recognition of the pop artists and things being able to do that. So the influences are being pulled in from everywhere.
They really have. So you've got Asian influences.
He loved that quote, good poets borrow, great poets thieve. He loved that. He really thought that was true. And I agree with that. I don't think there's anything that's completely new. Everything draws from what's gone before.
But the art is to
It's
take
clear.
those influences and make them something distinctly yours.
Yeah.
You look at these works and you know
Yeah.
that they're by Brett Whiteley. Actually, do you get a sense that when you are curating, when you are placing these works that you are so familiar with into a space, that you know what Brett would also like? I mean, in terms of aesthetics and the way he would hang?
I have to trust myself in that thing. I don't think I've ever done anything consciously anyway. Oh God, he'd hate that. We didn't argue about things like that. We argued about other things, but not that. Not the aesthetic, usually. So that's always been a pretty, that was always okay.
Consistent vision.
Yeah. So I just hope everybody absorbs it and loves it. And uses it. It doesn't exist without people kind of talking to it themselves. So
Absolutely.
this is a
People are
great
going,
opportunity for the locals to get into it again.
they're going to love it. It's a real privilege to have these works here in Bathurst, in the landscape of the Central West, for people to come and see and really connect to this region. And I just want to thank you on behalf of the gallery for allowing them to come to Bathurst.